This is chapter 14, part 3. We are talking about sort of trends in mass shootings the past few years and also trends in gun ownership in the past few years, what those have been. It is true that over the past 5 years or so, past several years, there has been a spike in the purchase of AR-15 style rifles. And that has been, I don't have it in the notes here, but that has been driven by social unrest, by spikes in homicide rates and violent crime, rioting, these sorts of things that scare people. Usually, if you see a spike in gun purchases, it's because of people are become more immediately afraid of social conditions, and out of fear they go buy guns to protect themselves. And also the evidence points towards, you also see these spikes in gun purchases if gun owners, these are people who most of them are already into guns and own several guns, and they'll go buy another gun out of fear when there's begins to be a lot of talk about new gun restrictions, perhaps banning certain types of guns. There's been talk in recent years about banning AR-15 style rifles, and so the public discussion bubbles up occasionally of gun restrictions, especially confiscation, or not so much confiscation, but banning certain weapons, that people will go out and buy those kinds of weapons because they're afraid that they're going to get banned and won't be available anymore. So they rush out and buy them because they want to beat the ban that they're worried is coming. So because of these factors in the past few years, the sales of AR-15 style rifles particularly have jumped a lot. But the problem is the author tries to connect this rush to go buy AR-15s in the past several years to the increases that you see in school shootings and some mass shootings. She tries to tie those together, but this is an incorrect linking of the two, because the spike. I mean, I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit on the notes here, but the spike in homicides that we've seen since 2020 have over 90% of those homicides that have occurred, the spike in homicides the past several years, have been committed with handguns, not with AR-15 style rifles. Over 90% of them, So these AR-15 rifles are not being used hardly at all in common homicides. That's driving the spike in the homicides from the past few years. Yes, it's true that AR-15s get used a lot nowadays in mass shootings, but the spike in homicides since 2020 has been with handguns, not with AR-15s. A common homicide, the vast majority of homicides, over 90% of them, are committed with handguns, not with rifles. Less than 10% are committed with rifles or shotguns. They're almost all, or not almost all, but vast majority are committed with handguns. So the type of gun being used doesn't match up with the argument that the author is making. And most new purchases have not been by first-time gun owners. They're most often made by people who already have guns. So they're not increasing the gun availability. Is, do you have a gun in your house or not? That's a good measure. Do you have a gun in your house or not? If there's more houses that have a gun, at least one gun, then you've got more availability. There's more guns floating around. If various houses all have, or many of them have guns. But if I have 5 guns already and I go get a 6th gun, I really haven't increased gun availability because I already had 5 before, and so there are plenty of guns there for someone to abuse. That 6th gun isn't going to make much of a difference. And so the percent of households is what's really kind of the main issue on how many are there guns within criminals' reach or not. The households is a good measurement of how many guns, how easily accessible guns are to criminals. The author is also incorrect in her claim that the spike in AR-15s purchased since 2020 have been matched by a spike in homicides, because well over 70% of this spike were committed with handguns. So that's a point that I just made. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit. Now, there's a recent hypothesis about, well, why is it that we've seen such a spike in homicides since 2020? Specifically since 2020. And if you look at the fine-grained data that's like monthly data of homicides, you see this vast increase in homicides, a peak, I should say a spike, happening immediately after the death of George Floyd. It's in the late spring 2020. That since that time we saw a huge spike in homicides. Not only homicides, but also in fatal car accidents. You see huge spikes in both of those things post the death of George Floyd. And so the hypothesis, which the data that I've seen, the fine-grained data I've seen, definitely backs up this hypothesis. But such, new claims, they require, they need a lot of evidence before you can say things with confidence. So it's just a hypothesis at this point. But the hypothesis is that after the death of George Floyd, that law enforcement, police officers became so wary of aggressively enforcing the law, of being very proactive in enforcing the law, that basically they pulled back and said, well, this is, we're just going to not engage with the public and do kind of take more of a minimal approach in our enforcing the law. And so the hypothesis is that the word got out, the signal ended up being communicated to criminally prone people that, hey, the police aren't enforcing the law anymore. They're not stopping you if you speed. They're not stopping you if you're committing crimes. And so the hypothesis is that as a result of that, the law enforcement pulling back, that you got more homicides, more shootings, more homicides, more fatal car accidents as a sort of a result of that pullback by law enforcement. Again, this kind of little bit, there's data behind this, but it's we have to consider it a hypothesis. I don't put any confidence in that at this point. It's just an idea that's out there, and I'm only suggesting it that there's lots of others what would seem to be more plausible hypotheses than these AR-15s leading to all these homicides, when these homicides are not being committed with AR-15s. So it doesn't make sense. The post-2020 spike in homicides has now ended. So that's it. You had this big spike in 2020 and went up 2020, 2021, peaked, and it has not continued to spike for the last year or a couple of years. It has not spiked, even though the sales of AR-15 style rifles continues to spike, continues to go up and up. I mean, it was only, if you go back 20 years, there were probably no more than 1 million AR-15 style rifles in the United States. Let's say roughly 1 million. Go back a couple decades. It's probably 25 million now. So there continues to be a spike in purchases of these sorts of weapons, and yet the homicide rate, despite that spike, the homicide rate has plateaued. And it's not being caused by access to AR-15s anyway, because those homicides are being committed over 90% of the time with handguns. So the author raises the issue of self-defensive gun use, or SDGU. Scholars disagree. This is an area, well, like many areas with guns, where we just don't know. We don't have confidence because the scholars disagree on the data. They disagree on the issue. They disagree about the frequency. How often does a person use a gun to defend himself or herself and scare off a would-be criminal? That is disagreed upon depending on the data. I'm not going to get into it here, the whole debate. But the data on the low end suggests that people use guns to defend themselves and scare off criminals about 50,000 times per year in the United States. That's on the low end. You have other surveys, other data, which indicate it could be 2.5 million, 3 million, over 3 million per year. Some of that data is a little bit old now, but you wouldn't expect it to change that much from year to year. So it's vast. Those are vastly different estimates. So we just don't really know how often guns are preventing crime or scaring away criminals by it being used in a self-defensive way by citizens. So so this makes it hard to know how big of a role is played by this self-defensive gun use. And the author cites research that suggests that SDGUs are not very effective at stopping crime. So she lays out evidence there, and that's something to think about as well. Just because you have a gun and you're able to use it, it doesn't necessarily scare off the criminal, doesn't necessarily prevent the crime from happening. I think I had a note here that other research that the author does not cite has found that even saying you have a gun, just a minimal presence of a gun, even if it's in your pocket and you're just saying, "Hey, I got a gun in my pocket, get out of here." Even just saying that, or definitely if you brandish the gun, if you pull it out and show it to somebody, point it at them, that is usually more than sufficient to convince the criminal to take off and move along and to leave you alone. That usually works to stop a crime, according to other research that's out there. But the negative part of that is, while it usually stops, say, a robbery or maybe an attack or something from happening, it does raise the stakes, according to the data, of being killed, of ending up dead. Because you pull a gun on somebody, you're basically raising the stakes of the encounter. And so that might scare the criminal away, but there's also the small chance that the criminal may resist, and not only resist, but end up killing you because you're resisting. So you're basically, the data seem to point to raising the stakes. If you as a defensive person, as the victim, have a gun, it kind of raises it often works, but it can raise the risk of you being killed. So certainly you would want people who use guns defensively to know how to use them, be confident, comfortable with them, so that if they are using them, they successfully are stopping a crime and not just getting themselves hurt. Most mass killers obtain their guns legally, and most minors get their guns from home. That's cited from the author, and the author's correct about that. The author claims that guns are very affordable, and I would push back just mildly on that, because her focus in this chapter is mostly on these AR-15 weapons, which I would not call them cheap. I would not call them inexpensive. Very typically, you're going to pay more than $1,000 for an AR-15, and I would not call that very affordable. Maybe for wealthy people, but for most ordinary folks, $1,000 plus, $1,500 is a lot of money to come up with to buy a gun. The author critiques the greater traditional restrictiveness of handguns over rifles. Okay, so a lot of the gun restrictions historically, traditionally, have been more towards handguns than rifles, and she critiques that. Because now we see with a lot of these mass shootings that AR-15s or the rifles are being used in the mass shootings. And so she says, hey, we need to focus our gun restrictions on rifles. But as I cited before, over 90% of all gun violence, let's focus on homicides, where the data is clearest. Those over 90% of homicides are committed with handguns, not rifles and not shotguns. And so this is one problem you run into, where you focus on these mass shootings, which are a small percent of all gun attacks, or small percent of all homicides. You get a different set of priorities, and it can sort of actually distort the big picture. Handguns are the big picture problem. Rifles are a specialized problem, a problem of these mass shootings. And so, she's focused on this narrow, I understand her issue on this narrow, her focus on this narrow issue of mass shootings. But big picture, she's portraying sort of a different priority and emphasis than a big picture emphasis would do. The author's correct that guns are easy to learn how to use. No doubt about that. They're usually designed to be fairly easy to use, a little bit of instruction. The author cites evidence that the 1994 to 2000 ban on new purchases of AR-15s resulted in fewer high fatality mass shootings and deaths. And so, yes, she cites evidence on that. again, you see a little bit of a discrepancy here between mass shooting research and general homicide, general violence research. That research has clearly found that ban, 1994 to 2004 ban, had no effect, had zero effect on the total homicide rate, not mass shootings, total homicide rate. Philip Cook, the author of the first book you read in this course, stresses that. And he's someone who is sympathetic to gun restrictions and trying to optimize safety in the United States. So he's not an anti-gun control person, but he says the evidence is clear that ban of new purchases of AR-15s did not bring down overall homicide rate. And you have to trust, as a researcher, you have to trust the homicide literature, total homicide literature, more than the mass shootings literature, because the mass shootings literature is much smaller. There's much less data. The data is much smaller sample sizes, and so the results, the conclusions are much sketchier or difficult to put a lot of confidence in compared to the homicide studies, which have much more data, much larger sample sizes. Again, say 20,000 homicides per year versus 1% of that for mass shootings. And so rare things are hard to study. It's hard to figure out rare things. And less rare things like total homicides are going to be, you can have more confidence in the findings there. The author claims that the states with the most restrictive gun laws tend to have the lowest gun homicide rates. Again, and I can't stress this enough because this is an error that folks are making all the time. The issue is not gun homicides. The issue is total homicides. Are gun laws reducing total homicide rate? That's the issue. If a gun law was reducing gun homicides, but you just had a proportionate increase in knife homicides, then your gun laws are doing no good to reduce death in your country. The issue is total homicides. And again, so not gun homicide rate, since killers in restricted states might simply kill with some other weapons, knives, blunt instruments, etc. And also, a lot of this research, if you just make this simple bivariate correlation, restrictive gun laws, less gun homicide in those states, that's oversimplistic kind of analysis. Anybody who does research know that you need to consider a lot of other variables. You have to conduct multivariate analysis looking at many variables, not just only the gun laws. Because, for example, we know that the South dominates in having high homicide rates. And the South also tends to have relaxed gun laws compared to other states. But it's just one example of one factor that needs to be ruled out, is that what about this subculture of violence? Maybe it's not guns in the South that are causing a lot of total homicide. Maybe it's a culture that's more positive towards violence and more approving of violence that leads to higher homicide rates. You have to rule out other factors like subculture of violence to have greater confidence that gun laws are effective in bringing down homicide. Overall, really, at least as I read it, the overall research finds little evidence that restrictive gun laws in states across the country are reducing total homicide. The evidence is, just as I see it, is not very strong in that area. Again, if it were strong, I would have no problem with it if that were the case. But I'm not seeing that the gun laws are overall that the general restrictiveness is making much of a difference. Let's stop right there and we'll pick it up in the next segment.